Hello, I'm Krista McAllister, and welcome to Serious Leadership. Whether you're growing your business, growing your career, or possibly both, thank you for listening. I am thrilled to have two incredible thought leaders joining our discussion today. Katie Burke, a family law attorney, workplace investigator, and family office mediator. I thank you so much for being here, Katie.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
And Kristina Hill, interim HR leader for growing businesses with a particular expertise in family offices.
Nice
I'm
to
so
be here
glad.
today.
It's wonderful because I always learn so much from the two of you, and I appreciate your unique perspectives on how we can transform the way we navigate very kind of chaotic situations and really become the catalyst for a more harmonious, engaging work environment. You each are brought into situations that can often be emotionally charged, and you are the ones to be the calming voice to help everyone involved really find that path forward. And we've all seen these situations. I mean, you've got this blend of circumstances and personalities that can quickly turn things very uncomfortable at work. It's like this tornado effect that tends to cause a lot of issues, sometimes chaos, and it really ends up causing everyone a lot of stress. From the different situations that each of you are pulled into, what are some common ones that you see lead to that tornado effect and they almost get spun out of control? Katie, why don't we lead off with you?
Sure. So I can think of three, and they all three have to do with limited resources. So the first one is the limited resource of budget in the workplace. When people in different departments or various members on a team, whoever needs to split whatever money is available for whatever project they're working on, that can cause friction because everybody, thinks their idea is the most important and what they're working on is the most important to them. The second is the limited resource of somebody's attention and praise, whoever it is that people find meaning from, that can cause all kinds of things that I'll talk about later that remind me and remind people who are thinking in these terms of family systems of families competing for parents' attention. And then the third would be the limited resource of time. So just when things get really rushed and people can't be on their best behavior that how they would like to be because everybody's stressed, and that's when the blame game can happen. And if this had happened sooner, then I would have gotten this or something like that.
We can picture these because we've all been in these situations. I know, Christine, I can only imagine some of those situations that you get called into. What do you see leading up to that?
I see a lot of individuals wanting to do the best that they can, but are operating from a place of fear or not understanding. So there's a misalignment, and they're trying to hold on to whatever their understanding is or what they can control within the situation. And so sometimes you get a loss of everyone wanting to come to the table with an open mindset and willingness to kind of get to the next step. And when we're trying to evolve an organization and lead it through its change, most of the time we are having to kind of manage the behavioral components and the readiness for the change. And the prep work that comes with that is being transparent and setting the ground rules for how we are going to engage together and what are our kind of the purpose and objectives of working together. And when everyone is aligned on the understanding and the roadmap that we're going to follow to get there, then it allows for more meaningful work to get done because it's clear and everyone has a stake in the game and understands what that stake is.
I mean, most of us leaders of organizations, we don't necessarily lead through change on a day-to-day basis. So it's tough to think through some of those things that you just mentioned, recommendations for kind of being proactive. How do we communicate? How do we take away that fear? And you're generally getting called in and helping out, helping to set that up, or when some of us don't get it right, unwind that. What are some of the strategies to stay calm and composed when we don't get it right and those stressful situations occur?
Well, I've found that for myself, what I need to do to stay steady and calm is to rely on my own expertise and my frameworks that I put in place in order for me to be successful. So when we start to veer off our journey, I tend to go back to the set of purpose, objectives, and key results that we laid out at the beginning of the project or change management process, and try to get everyone else to refocus. Or if we're in the middle of a conflict and trying to resolve a conflicting opinion on a strategic objective, one of the things that has always worked for me is to kind of feel the temperature of the room and really try to find the right times where we can take a break, step away, and then come back to the table when we're kind of fresh and have had maybe a 10 to 15 minute kind of pause. Because sometimes these conversations can get quite heated, and there's a lot of personal emotion that can be brought into the conversation, because if we're making a change and it's a change that a COO was leading initially, and we're pivoting the kind of ownership of leading that change to someone else in the organization, there can sometimes be a feeling of, not meeting the objective, or, losing that control, or, it was my baby. I raised it to this level. Like, I should be able to continue on leading it, but sometimes there needs to be that change of perspective. So for myself, trying to keep people aligned with the purpose and try to give that psychological safety during the change management process so that everyone feels heard and validated, but also trying to manage the emotional components of it, and finding those breaks in the conversation to allow people to refocus.
You just mentioned psychological safety, and I really want to come back to that. So I just made a note because I think that's such an important component of this. And you mentioned that control. We can't always control the circumstances around us, but we can control our reactions to it. Katie, you're in some very interesting discussions, both with your family law practice as well as workplace investigations and mediations. What are your recommendations, or even some of your tools for managing emotions and kind of keeping composure in a meeting? Because once you lose it, that is a really tough one to gain back that respect, or gain back what we may have lost when we said things we shouldn't. How do you manage through that and to keep really control that the way that we react to it?
Yes. I'll use an example from my family law practice. So I draft a lot of premarital agreements, and I've been thinking about this a lot lately, because that's one example of many I could come up with about times when I get things really in order. I like to plan ahead. I'm a clear communicator, and everybody else is just messing up my world. And in the premarital agreement environment, what that looks like a lot of times is I'll draft the agreement and I'll get everything done on whatever timeline I say we need to do it in. And whoever's drafting is really leading the whole process. And then sometimes I get a really good reviewing attorney and everything goes really smoothly. But the vast majority of cases, I'll get somebody who waits till the last minute, either intentionally as a strategy to throw something in when there's not enough time to negotiate, so they think, or they do it because there's inertia. They just don't want to review something that they didn't draft, and they have to, come up with something to say back. I used to get really annoyed at whoever that individual attorney was on the other side who would do that kind of thing. And then I recently started thinking about it and thinking, that most of the time, this is actually exactly what's going to happen. So rather than looking at that person as such a problem and then getting in that kind of stomping, whether they ever see it or not, because there is the thing you talked about losing it, and that's just really bad, but also just your own kind of composure and realizing you're still in control of everything, and it's okay. Everyone has the goal to get this done by the same time, and it's just a question of how we do it. So I've started really just reminding myself of that, and it's really pattern matching. It's like, oh yeah, this is just like that other one where so-and-so did this. And I don't have to feel badly about this other person. I don't have to feel like, poor me, now I'm working later tonight than I thought I would. It's like now when I take on a premarital agreement or whatever any other kind of example is, I can pretty much expect this is going to be the cadence. And then if it doesn't happen that way and everything's smoother than I expect, then that's great. But if it falls apart in the end, or there's a little chaos created in the end that could have been avoided, I've really come to see that's, I think, human nature for the most part. And you're rarely working with an entire team of people who all think ahead and do things in a really organized way. So that's my example. And when I think that way, I just am calm. I'm like, this is fine. I've done this 10 million times before. I can skip the huffing and puffing step. And now I can just realize, we have leverage. We all have the same amount of time to get this thing done. And it's not a catastrophe.
And I think too, like as advisors and integrated individuals into organizations, one of the biggest takeaways that I've realized to be successful is to raise your hand when you start to see things pivoting from what you expected, and to raise when you're starting to embark on an obstacle or challenge, or you may see one in the horizon based on the decisions that's being made right now. And oftentimes there's oh, I don't want to disrupt the process, or, I don't want to, if we raise our hand and say, this isn't going to work now, this is going to, derail the last 6 months of work that we just put into this process. So maybe we're just going to let it slide and let it go underneath, push it under the rug, but it always comes back around. And no matter how hard you try to avoid any of the challenges or obstacles that are faced, it's, sometimes unavoidable, but it's even more unavoidable if you raise your hand and you say, okay, we're starting to, meet some conflict here, and let's stop, pause, and address it, and then we can move forward.
I think that you came up with something of, sometimes it's not what you're doing, but how you're doing it, the language that you're using. How, as a business leader, how are you being that steady presence, that calm voice, and being able to find the right words so that you're not causing disrupt, because will come off as disruption. Wait a minute, stop what we're doing. What are some recommendations on how to come about that in a productive way versus coming across as, Kristen's stopping the train again, let's all get off? What are some recommendations for coming across in a productive way that, you're not just wreaking havoc?
Great question. I think the most important thing is to know your client and know the subcultures of that client, whether it's that they might be have resistance to myself bringing up a problem because maybe they don't necessarily see it. We'll see it as one. They've never gone through a process like this before. And so there needs to be a bit of education and some presetting of expectations. And then also I think it's understanding their motivators, and everyone has a different motivation for wanting to get on board with change. And so you change your language based on the audience that you're trying to persuade or like lead through the building of consensus. And I think it depends on what level of the group that you're meeting with. So if you're meeting with the C-suite, you might address the possible obstacle or challenge in the way that it speaks to financial success or financial impact. If we move forward without discussing or resolving the obstacle, that might lead to a talent issue where we might not be able to attract or retain talent. And if the organization has growth goals that they're trying to achieve, and not being able to attract or retain the talent is going to be detrimental to achieving our success, then I need to kind of structure the way that I'm bringing up the information in the context or through the lens of, well, we're not going to be able to achieve these things on this side of the business, like retaining talent or attracting talent, if we don't, address it now, for these different things.
And that's especially when you've got that relationship built, you've got the long-term planning in place, and you said, look, we can take it back to our values, we can take it back to our goals. I know, Katie, you're sometimes stepping into a new situation when you're doing an investigation, you're brought in to do a mediation, and you don't necessarily have those to tie it back to, what are some tools that you use to kind of keep everyone tied to what are the facts versus our interpretation of the facts,
Mhm.
and being able to find that commonality or alignment with what each person's goals are versus what we're actually maybe arguing or having conflict over?
Mhm. I really listen. I really believe in listening, and I'm a storyteller, so I really like to hear people's stories. And I try really hard not to quickly jump to a narrative. Like if I'm doing an investigation and I need to figure out what happened, I can kind of have some sense from what the employer contact tells me of what the situation is. Let's say it's a sexual harassment claim. So I can sort of go in thinking, okay, I have a general sense of what I think happened. And then once I talk to people, it's Kristina and I were just talking about this a few minutes ago before we started, that it's rarely that clear cut. It's rarely really, really the way it's been presented to me because, of course, the employer most of the time doesn't have the information I'm about to find out. So I really try to definitely get on a level with the person I'm talking to where they feel as comfortable as possible, knowing they're talking to an investigator and maybe not knowing exactly what that means. And I try to explain as well as I can what that means. And then once I get a sense, I just talk to as many people as I feel like I need to until I really have a sense of what I think is going on. And I don't expect to ever know 100% what's going on. I don't ever expect anyone in the work environment is going to be 100% candid with the person they're talking to, especially if they know that person's an investigator. But I do try to get a really clear sense from listening deeply to people. And one of the things that the three of us were talking about recently is an investigation I did where I had two people who were deeply, deeply entrenched in their conflict. And this was a very, very long-standing conflict. These are two employees working on the same team. And when I spoke to each of them, everything one of them said seemed completely plausible. And then so I kind of thought I knew what was going on. And then I talked to the other person, and everything that person said sounded completely plausible. And these puzzle pieces would not fit together. And then when I asked, as I always do you have any documents I should look at that would help me see your point of view? And both of them gave me the exact same set of emails to show how the other person was so problematic in the ways they'd explained. And I thought that was a really profound
Oh,
thing that they would do that. I mean, there are some situations where there's clearly a bad actor, and this isn't just a like, you see it this way, but you see it that way. That's a different kind of situation. But there are these other places where to listen to one person say something about the other person, I would have thought I was going to meet a monster. And then I talked to that person. I'm like, well, I kind of like that person. And then also, I know that I'm also not working side by side with them. So there's some level of visibility that I'm never going to have because they're giving me how they see it in their mind.
mhm.
So, there are just all these things going on. But my way is just to try to talk to as many people as I can who have relevant information and just try to get a sense of what's happening. So, for example, in that case, the employer, they can't tell me who to talk to, but they were hoping I would only talk to these two people. And I said, there's no way. I'm totally on board. I can't tell by talking to the two of them what's happening. But I found somebody who was a dispassionate, also longtime team member who had really distanced themselves from this conflict, or so they thought, because you can't really ever do that. And just getting a much more dispassionate view really helped me a lot.
It's interesting. She just mentioned, and a third person was pulled into that. Each of them had a narrative. That third individual was pulled into it and was trying to not be pulled into it. It happens quite a bit when there is conflict because the more individuals you have on your team or on your side or believing in your narrative, it's almost as though it becomes more of that reality and you can almost make it true and you can make that narrative. How do you help sift through that and help get to the facts of, we understand what the narratives are, but let's almost create a new narrative that you both can align or agree to?
Right. So in that case, if I were mediating in that case, I was the investigator in that one, but if I were mediating, That one's a hard one because that was a long-standing thing. They'd had mediators try to come in before, but I think for sure, people really, really want to be heard and they want to feel like their perspective is understood. And I'm always not amazed, but I feel like I'm it's almost always true that if you give people the space to talk about what it is that they're trying to accomplish, and this other person's getting in the way of that or whatever, and they really feel heard, and you really have a discussion about, listen, these are the budgetary challenges with that, these are the things, like getting them to empathize with the environment that they're actually in. I just find that you can make a lot of progress because people, so often I see people just quickly go into judgment or quickly go into problem solving mode. And that doesn't give the people who are entrenched in the conflict an opportunity to empathize with what the employer is trying to do or whoever it is that is kind of the arbiter of this dispute. And when they can see, I mean, when I ask questions, now I'm going to flip to investigation again. When I ask questions in an investigation and I feel like somebody's just trying to push their agenda with me, sometimes I'll say, I'm really stuck because I'm trying to figure out, like I know they're not telling me something. And I'll just name it. I'll just say, I'm trying to figure out if this is happening and this is happening. And it's kind of like people don't want to see someone struggle, like the people will come in and help me with the thing that they were trying to not tell me. And it's really important information. And they're afraid to tell me for all kinds of different reasons that make a lot of sense if they're in a dysfunctional environment. I think really being authentic in those moments where I'm not playing a role. Yes, I have a job to do, but I am a person who is now invested in these stories and I'm invested in these people and I'm trying to figure out a way to help. And if they've been in the job as long as the people I'm talking about, they have some investment in that too, whether it looks that way or not, because sometimes it just looks like they're like 100% invested in their own position. So that's what I do, is just really, it sounds so simple, but I think a lot of things that don't work are because people are just thinking of what they're going to say before that other person's finished talking versus really letting that person have their 15 minutes of fame, so to speak. That's not the right expression, but to really let them air out what they're talking about and feel like you understand and you're truly trying to create solutions.
I think the listening piece is critical, and then once you're listening and you gather all the subjective data, I'll call it, figuring out a way to make it objective. And one way that, I've done it on the, HR side, when I come into an organization that's in a culture crisis, the first thing that I start doing is a HR assessment and start talking to key stakeholders and team members within the organization at all different levels and tenure. And what I often find is that I have to kind of build that rapport first and foremost and make them feel comfortable. And I think I've been the most successful at this is, I'm a type of HR leader that will come in and walk among the people, so to speak, instead of coming in and having, somewhat of that stereotypical, approach of I'm here to make sure we're compliant and here's all the policies and procedures and we have to follow this, and this. It's, well, why are we doing that? And tell me more. And then when I, need to identify the culture aspects that are harming the organization, I often do an employee engagement or some type of survey with a, set of questions that everyone can answer the same way, or, at least we're asking it in a consistent way. So we're getting back the data that people are willing to share. And I often say that if you're not willing to share it in an objective way, then there's not much I can do in a subjective way. Like I can take that as a data point, but we really need to have the objective data and a way to gather that so that we can also then test the organization as we evolve to make sure that we're successful and meeting what the, pain points are, or, those gaps in solving the culture issues.
It's interesting. You both use such an important word as to how you're able to do what you do and be that steady constant amongst chaos and stress. You both use the word comfortable. You help them feel comfortable. And I equate that word comfortable to you gain their trust. They trust that you're going to do the right thing and you're trying to help, versus maybe have some ulterior motives to it. And sometimes that's hard to see through that when you've got a number of different parties involved. And Kristen, you mentioned earlier psychological safety. You've mentioned culture crisis. I want to double click on that a little bit. And what does it look when you don't have psychological safety in that? Because it's, how do you fix stuff when we have those kinds of issues? I'm guessing you usually have to start there.
Yeah, yeah. And it's kind of identifying what are the catalysts that have led to psychological safety, because I often have seen that when a new hire comes into an organization, there is trust and there's respect for the process and a, desire to follow the rules and do their job and meet their individual goals. But then as time goes on and, either experiences with management, don't go successfully, or they thought that they were doing their job well, and then they were kind of blindsided by a performance review that didn't go well, or, they got in trouble for something that they didn't feel like they were in the wrong for. And then slowly those small instances start to erode the trust and psychological safety. And then there becomes a organization that is operating more on fear base instead of what's right. There's silent quitting that starts to happen. So you have disengagement, and sometimes that can even happen with your top performers and your key employees. So if that's happening at that level, what other kind of damage is happening with other employees that are disengaged, and how does that impact the bottom line? And really to start repairing that and regain the level of trust, it starts from the top. And you have to do a lot of work with the ownership and founding principals or the C-suite that's leading the organization, and be a mirror to them, and kind of figure out what are some of the coaching mechanisms that we can put in place. How can I partner with those leaders or employee groups to show up a bit more for them, either joining, weekly calls or helping with, performance conversations, being an advocate for the employees that I work with. While I'm usually hired for the company and I have the company's best interest at heart, if I'm not also playing the dual role of the employee advocacy and advocating for them, then I'm not establishing the trust with the employee group. And at the end of the day, that's who needs to come along with our change management process. I also think that it's really important to, if we are going to say we're going to improve our culture as an organization, to then make sure that we're able to make some change as a result of us asking our employee group, what do you need from us? How can we be better? How do you see your leadership? How much confidence do you have in this organization that we're going to be able to achieve our business results? And if we get the answers that we don't like, we have to be comfortable with still making some change in order to regain that trust and that psychological safety. But it starts from the beginning when you're on day one of your new employment experience through your entire life cycle, whether it's as short as 6 months or as long as 20 years. I think that there's ebbs and flows, and you constantly have to have a pulse on how the organization's doing and how it's influenced by the type of people that come in and out of the organization at a given time.
I can imagine the challenge as you have new hires coming in, not everyone has the same background, the same perspective, the same viewpoint. And we're all really making an effort. How do we get diversity in the organization, including diverse viewpoints? We want people who don't think the same way as we do. And I can only imagine, Katie, the kinds of conflicts as a workplace investigator, that you get brought in when we don't see things the same way. We have diverse perspectives. How do you see organizations navigate through that? We'll say staying clear of unhealthy conflict, but encouraging healthy conflict. One of my favorite topics, because I always thought that, what do you mean? Conflict's bad, right? Apparently not. It's
Right. Yeah.
How do you help companies, navigate and identify, this is the kind of conflict we don't want, and this is good, healthy conflict because we're showing diversity and we're showing respect? How do you help them navigate through that?
Right. I think that one's so hard because especially if an organization gets big enough, as much as so many organizations say, we want innovative thinkers, we want people who think differently, we want this and that, it's so easy, or let's say it's so hard not to file into these same narratives that happen, with any company that thinks I'm going to do it differently. And then it just starts, if it gets big enough, it just sort of becomes, it's not safe to talk about this. It's not, like this is that we're kind of doing token diversity hires where, and things just sort of become very rote. And one of the things that I think employers can do is, I mean, building on what Kristina was talking about with psychological safety, that's huge because people really have to genuinely trust in their leader that they can be candid with them. And I have seen those things build in organizations where it may not be every team, and that's what you have to work on, each team being able to do this well. But I have seen people in organizations be able to say to their boss, it really bothers me that you're 10 minutes late to every meeting we have together. And that's something that seems so simple, like two humans should be able to say to each other. But a lot of organizations, it's like someone wouldn't even say that to their boss. It would be like, however late they want to be, it's fine. And one of the things, my biggest thing about how to avoid dysfunction, or why, I'll say why to avoid dysfunction, is that I really believe that organizations work like families. And I hate when employers say we're a family here, because I think that's very dangerous language, because as we all know in the work that we do, it can't exactly operate like a family, because you may love that person, but if you need to let them go because something, they did something and you'd be on the wrong side of the law if you kept them, or, whatever the circumstances are, or you don't have the money to keep them, or whatever it is, it doesn't really operate like most families. But I have a huge belief. I've studied group dynamics. I have a master's in counseling. I studied psychology in undergrad, and I really believe that we show up with our family of origin issues, and then we file into these roles that what I've learned them as is golden child, scapegoat. These are usually roles assigned to children in a family. Golden child, scapegoat, black sheep, peacemaker. And what those mean is a golden child is, this person can do no wrong. A lot of times it's a firstborn, or, maybe an early employee, or whatever, somebody with a very unique skill. The black sheep is somebody who just is rebellious and just kind of difficult. Maybe they also have some unique skills, so you keep them along, but they're really just a total pain in the butt to have around. In a family, it can be somebody who really, really struggles with a lot of different issues that the family isn't equipped to deal with. A peacemaker is what it sounds like. It's somebody who tries to keep the peace in the family. But what happens if the family or organization is dysfunctional enough? The peacemaker is actually keeping peace at the expense of someone who might be getting bullied, someone who might be getting discriminated against, not getting the right opportunities. So peacemaker can sound like a really good thing, but if the dysfunction gets where things are all really skewed, you can't really keep peace in sort of a pacifying way without it having things get really favoring people who are abusing power. And then the other one is the scapegoat, which is my personal favorite because that's what it was in my family, where it's the truth teller. And in a really healthy organization, you don't really have these roles, or you might have them, but they're not as pronounced. Or you can have the flip of it. So like the scapegoat is somebody who gets blamed for the truth they're telling. And everyone on some level knows it's going on, or should know it's going on. But the person who, let's say, manifests it or speaks it out or something like that, everybody looks at that person like, oh, why is that person always causing problems? And often, and that disproportionately falls on women, especially people of color, women of color, partly because these are people who will stand up to the status quo and say this isn't right, partly because often these are the people who are disproportionately misused or abused in the environment. So they're actually seeing through a different lens that maybe somebody else they don't actually see what's going on because it's not happening to them. There are all kinds of ways this shows up, but what I really advocate for is get as healthy as you can with communication and some of the other things we've been talking about, because you can't manage your way out of these dynamics. You can't hire your way out of them. People are going to file into these roles in one way or another. So this idea that, you as the employee could leave a job and you're not going to find this kind of drama again. Yes, you are. I mean, if there are enough people together, of course you are. Or the idea as an employer, if you're like, if we just get rid of this person, we're not going to have this problem anymore. You are. It's like something about the way the universe is designed where groups need all these different kinds of people. But when it gets really dysfunctional, all those roles get really distorted and people kind of have a victim mindset as opposed to a scapegoat being a truth teller, which should be an actually very affirming thing and very empowering for the company. The peacemaker being able to broker peace when it can't be brokered. I mean, that's a really powerful thing if they're not doing it at the expense of somebody being victimized. The black sheep, I don't know where the black sheep is. Maybe they're just not so bad. Maybe they're just kind of like punky and original and everybody appreciates what they're doing. And then the golden child, everybody can appreciate them more and not resent them because it's like there are enough accolades to go around. But I really think it's like, instead of looking at, oh, that person's such a problem, apart from the, what I think we all know is the obvious problematic types of people, or types of behaviors at work. But, if it's just sort of like this person's a little bit of a friction, there's friction with this, it's like, yeah, that's how it goes. And if you can work with it and make the organism healthier, then it's just going to be a better experience for everyone. And you'll see why that person who maybe really irritated you in the beginning is there and what their value is.
Love it. And Kristina, I can see that. I always love to say, okay, if every organization has these individuals, or we take on these roles in one way or another, again, a healthy organization 100% doesn't have any of that. As you mentioned, Katie, it exists in one way or another somewhere. If we're seeing some of this manifest in organization, I can only imagine that peacemaker, the straight, when you walk into an organization and you spot someone who's just taking the burden of everything, they're trying to buffer, they're trying to be that peacemaker. What are some ways to address it in an open and healthy way? Because I can imagine sitting here going, oh, yep, that person's this person. Yep, that person's that role. Yep, that I'm now aware of it. Not Katie's made me aware of it. What can I do if I'm recognizing? We'll set the family aside for a minute. That one I probably need a therapist on. But in the workplace, as you're coming in as the HR professional, what are some ways that you can help address that now that we're aware of it? Knowledge is power.
Yeah, so maybe less about identifying like how an individual fits into the different categories. So I think that's a great illustration of exactly what is in every organization. You fall into one of those categories, right? But it's taking a step back and looking at how the organization is supporting the diverse perspectives and what do we value. So maybe the peacemaker, for example, is getting or is having more success, but why? Is it because they're just keeping the status quo and are really good at managing up and down so that everyone just feels like there's stability and consistency? Versus we like the black sheep because that person's a disruptor and a disruptor for the positive. Maybe they have a certain skill set, experience level, diverse, expertise that we would be able to leverage. But in an organization that doesn't have a clear set of strategic goals or a vision or purpose that we're driving towards, those that don't fit exactly into our perfect mold will then start to erode the effectiveness of the team because they're really starting to show up in their archetypes. And then I think too, once we have identified that we have some of these archetypes, it's how do we want to continue to move forward with our strategy to have diversity and equity and inclusion. But we don't really know how to get there. And it starts with defining what are our values. And if we have a clear set of values, let's say that one of them is boldness, we can take boldness and allow it to permeate in all of the different areas of our organization. And we can recruit people who value boldness, but maybe come from a different industry when their perspective we could leverage. Or in performance management, we may think that if someone is showing boldness in achieving their goals or going above and beyond or has that behavioral component, that might be a leadership attribute that we want to continue to reinforce and move forward in the organization. And if we have to replace that position, what are we looking for to bring someone in to replace that also shares those core values, but has different perspectives, experience, skills that could complement the teams that we already have?
Something that reminds me of when you said that, Kristina, is I was in a meeting a couple weeks ago or a week ago when somebody who's some kind of coach in employment situation said, you, the leader, should be repeating your core values in every single meeting. And I thought that was really, I thought, wow, because I would feel like I was being repetitive if I did that. But if you think about it, it's like, if you aren't consistently repeating those values, then on the back end, you have all this cleanup that you were talking about, Kristina, where everybody's operating out of their archetypes because everybody defaults to their original patterning instead of kind of, staying in line. And hopefully it's a positive message because you are really molding people into your message. But if you have a message, I mean, I just think about places that I patronize and I walk in and it's like, I know all these people can't be this lovely 100% of the time by nature. Like this is surely they hired for that, but also they're being told the most important thing is that this person feels this particular way. I was just at a spa last week where I had that experience and I was like, this is just, it's like I walked into this other world. And that I feel like is that perfect combination of hiring really closely to your core values and what you're looking for, and then consistently making them known and understood. This is what's important. I mean, I think we can't underestimate the value of a parent, a boss, somebody who is setting the culture. It's like that means something to people, whether they like their boss or not. That is the person who's in the most perceived and usually actual seat of power. So anyway, that just occurred to me that you were talking that just having that repetition and having that really clear communication about this is what we expect, this is who we are, these are our values. People can kind of soften their individual edges and come into the mold a little bit.
I love that. And the bringing it back to the values, and everyone can tell stories about it. Where did we see our core values show up in work? How can we, and it's as repetitive as it can be, the stories that come out of it, of what happens on a week to week or monthly basis. You had mentioned the perspectives, Kristina, and I want to go back to a little bit on diversity is great and having those perspectives, but only if everyone's being heard. When I go back to what both of you have said, you're able to do that because you listen. You sit there and listen. How can we foster an environment where those diverse perspectives are known to be valued and they've got a safe place to be heard?
I think it comes first from the business owners or leadership group and instilling a sense of, we want you to be successful. So if you fail, get back up and try again. And it's not necessarily a slap on the wrist or a 3 strikes, you're out policy, where everyone is a bit fearful to make a mistake or to bring up a diverse perspective because they may then be seen as an outsider, a non-performer, someone who can't do the job or doesn't have the skill set to do so. So really making sure that we are able to provide a space of learning and reinforcing where we want to be as our expectations from performance, our expectations of compensation. We need to make sure that we're consistent with kind of who's at the seat of the table. We want to, if an employee doesn't have the right skill set because maybe they're still junior in their career or they've never worked in that function before, but we're bringing them over because they were really great at client services. So now we want to work on, this side of the business. Well, we have to make sure that we give them the tools and resources to be successful. And if they're not, understand that there is always a period of time where someone needs to kind of learn the new job or learn the new company and be able to kind of utilize their skill sets. But it takes kind of having that confidence that I have the time to learn, or I can, mess up and try again. And it's about, doing it better the next time. There's always those one-offs where it could be a really egregious mistake or a disruption in the organization. And, there has to be a departure because it wouldn't make sense to either that employee to stay in that position, or it'd be too high of a risk for the company to continue in that employment relationship with the individual. But most of the time, the things that happen are fixable. And if it was just more clearly stated, or the company had a better process or policy in place, and we were transparent about it, and there was candor and honesty about the situation, then 9 times out of 10, you can work through it. But if the manager doesn't have the confidence to feel like they can tell their team member, it's okay, we can try again. If the team member, is in fear of losing their job or not being considered for the promotion or not seen as the top performer, they may make decisions that are in their best interest or what they think is in their best interest, forgetting about the end result, which at the end of the day could make it look worse than if you just raised your hand and said, oops, sorry, made the mistake, let's fix it. So it's really about, understanding how we can get people to feel like they have the right tools and resources to do their jobs and the confidence to go out and do it, but also the confidence to say, I'm really sorry, I didn't do this right, I didn't understand. Please explain it to me more, and I'll do better next time.
I love the raising their hand, or even raising their hand and saying, I'm not sure how to do what you asked me to do. I need help. I need training, or you explained it to me. It makes no sense because I just came from customer service. And what you're telling me right now is wreaking havoc for us in customer service. How about we try something a little different? I love job swapping. Very big fan of taking individuals and giving them exposure to other areas. It really opens up that we want the perspective from here to be over here now.
Exactly. Or if you're making a culture change, for example, kind of understanding what are the core values, the guiding principles, or the gaps in culture that we need to change. And then the minute that a decision is made, a person acts a certain way, we make a shift in our, business objectives, we need to do a test of whether we're veering away from our culture driver, or what we're, going back to the center, and immediately course correcting, and allowing the individual or the organization to course correct instead of we failed, we did terribly, we're not going to make it, I feel like there's often a lot of punitive language used, or discouraging language, or just a discouraging feeling that comes up when you didn't do something right, where we need to, I think, effectuate a culture that is more positive, use positive language, use reinforcement, and incentives to kind of drive why you need to do the best you can.
Because I can imagine, Kristina, what you do, a lot of conflict arises, you talked about earlier, is that finger pointing, that blame game. And especially when you may not know Susie in accounting, you just know accounting. And it's real easy to say, hey, accounting, it's their fault. How do you help manage through some of that conflict, or help people share, here's how I'm receiving it. I'm not making you wrong, but I do want to help you be aware of it.
From the perspective of helping them improve their effectiveness.
Absolutely. And communication, I think it all comes back to what you mentioned earlier on communication.
Yeah, I mean, I always think it's important to help the individual reframe their perspective. So if it is about the staff accountant and their performance, and maybe they need to improve their performance, it's having the conversation focus around, first, what do you want to be doing? And what do you like to do? And are you doing the work that believe you were hired to do? And if that is not the case, then it's trying to get them to give me the information so that I can go back to their manager or the department head and say, okay, I think we need to do a job analysis, or this person has been doing the job for the last 5 years and we've had a lot of turnover in the organization. So now they're doing 2 or 3 different jobs, and we need to kind of put them back into their lane, and we need to look at hiring capacity, or what does the organization need? Because maybe it's evolved further than when this role was initially hired and this person was doing the work. I also think it's important when I'm having these conversations to talk with them about how they need to be managed and what are they not getting from their manager, and vice versa, talking with the manager and figuring out what is their style and how do they expect their teams in this individual to interact with them, and then try to find some commonality and some new structure and frameworks to put in place so that both can be more successful, either with the manager giving more guidance to this person. Maybe we put in a timeline for hiring additional capacity to increase the bench strength. And so this individual can feel a bit more confident that they're not going to be underwater for too much longer. And they will be able to, improve their performance because they'll actually be working on the things that they know how to do. And it's a value add to the company.
I love it. And Kay, you mentioned at the beginning, sometimes a lot of these conflicts do arise from resource constraints, and we end up taking them on personally. We're taking them on too much. So we're able to have those conversations and help resolve that for the longer term. I think that there's been so many great stories, great information. I'd love to kind of summarize it because as outside professionals, sometimes, as you mentioned, we do need to ask for help from when we're inside an organization. We're not always equipped because we don't manage through conflict necessarily on a daily basis. And as a senior leader or as the owner of the company, it's tough for me to know exactly how to do that. And that's not my area of specialty. It's getting business and growing the company. So coming in as an outside expert, what would be some key pieces of advice if you were to coach me on really how to almost de-stress, take the stress out of your organization? Because your numbers may not be doing well right now. We may have to lay people off. We may need to do a lot of things, and that's going to cause stress. We may have a few tornadoes brewing, some subcultures going on. If you were to say, here are the key pieces of advice and takeaway, Kay, let's start with you. How would you coach me on that?
2 takeaways I would want any company owner or leader to have are the first that I was saying about the cadence of things. So even this is the example you gave where resources are limited, maybe shares are down, whatever it is. These are things that happen with every organization since the beginning of time. So if people can take a step back in management and try to recognize these are the ebbs and flows of owning a business or leading a business, and kind of depersonalize it from, why did this happen and this person screwed up the scene? It's like, well, because it's always like that. And then working from that place of equilibrium to just say, okay, well, what do we do when that kind of thing happens? And just trusting in the long game. And then the second part is the same thing about the people who are in your organization. I talked about those roles. And if you see someone who looks like a troublemaker of some kind or something like that, just remembering it's like, this is humans. This is how it all turned out. This is, and that's what you're going to get and again, aside from the bad actors, that's what you're going to get. This is what you're working with. And if you can have that foresight to know, oh, it is going to be a real pain to bring people in. It is going to be a real pain when 2 people on a team don't get along. So it's not just such a surprise to you every time it happens. It's better for your heart. It's better for your sanity if you just expect these things to happen and you don't know what form they'll take. But then when they do show up, you don't have that sort of interpersonal baggage of how upset you might otherwise get if you can really see it coming and just not know what the details, how they'll fill in.
Yep. I once got some great advice that said, you can't just always run away from tough situations or conflict situations because there will always be a tough and conflicting situation. Learn how to manage through it. And you've given some great advice to look at those patterns. Kristina, from all of your experiences in working through some of those stressful situations that happen with human capital and organizations, both of them living, breathing, ever-changing entities, what advice or key takeaways would you give someone?
I would start with, it's okay to take a pause in the organization. Sometimes it's actually more beneficial to stop and slow down go to a walking pace, evaluate the foundation that's been built. And then if you're taking that pause and being intentional for the work that's done while you're walking, it really helps you be able to run faster. And a lot of the organizations that I get brought into, I am coming in at an intersection of an issue that's just happened and been resolved. There's an issue that's been identified and it's causing significant turmoil in the organization. Maybe it's related to human capital. Maybe it's, related to a liquidity event or a merger and acquisition. And it really takes understanding how the organization started. And if it was in a startup environment, most of the time, everything was done in an ad hoc or, yes, we need this now, so we're just going to move forward. We're going to add this person because we really need someone in marketing and communications. Oh, we now need a CFO. Oh, we're going to be doing this new business venture, or we're really growing at a rapid pace and we weren't really expecting it. So we added a bunch of headcount. And now we are at this new phase of the organization and we don't really know our identity or where we're going, or do we have the right human capital to support our strategies? And in those moments is when we start to have breakdowns of psychological safety, because there's a misalignment of direction or roles of responsibilities, or there's too many employees wearing multiple hats and doing, functional responsibilities that should be consolidated. And so trying to come in and objectively evaluate the organization first and foremost, figure out a way to communicate the gaps that are found and identify those obstacles and challenges, but also recognize where the teams or organization are having success and figure out if that success is warranted, desired, celebrated, or would that success have looked differently if we would have had other things in place, whether it's a more clear structure for decision making and authority and knowing kind of who's responsible and has ownership over a function or a team or a strategic objective, or whether we need to reevaluate our structure and figuring out, do we have the right people, and defining our functional responsibilities in a way that it's clear that we can build upon that.
I love that. And in so many cases, when issues arise, I've done a number of postmortems, it all came back to not everyone was clear on their roles, responsibilities. They weren't clear on the values. They, as you said, they didn't have that foundation in place, and the wheels just came off the bus, and no one was sure where to go back to, what was home base.
Yes, and every organization has a different comfortability with levels of risk. And I think identifying what is the depth and breadth of risk that the company is willing to take on is really important. Because if they're more of a risk adverse organization, we'll probably be making incremental changes with less significant impact, immediate and long term. But if it's a company that is very comfortable with risk and has a lot on the line, if they don't evolve and change relatively immediately, well, then we need to kind of refocus our objectives and make sure that we're establishing our roadmap to be able to address that, trying to limit as much of the casualties as possible along the way.
Love it. You had mentioned that roadmap gives that clarity, the transparency, and as both of you talked about, the more transparency and information you can share, they're comfortable, they're trusting, and they feel they're safe. That's where we see organizations thrive. Thank you so much, Katie, Kristina, for all of your experiences. We're trying to pull it into one place here, and I appreciate all that you've shared, your stories, your advice, your experience, because we've all been in those situations. I think you're going to help us be just a little more aware of how to now stay calm and be that steady constant amongst what could easily be chaos. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Kristen.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much for joining me on Cerius Leadership.